Lucas Carter's hands were clenched around the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached. The steady hum of the car engine was drowned out by the storm raging in his head. Tokyo had been a blur, a flurry of business negotiations, deals, a revolutionary urban renewal plan that had the potential to shake up the whole industry. He should be celebrating. But there was this aching pain creeping into his chest, this growing feeling of dread eating away at his stomach. As he turned onto his suburban block, something was wrong. And then he saw it. A black Audi in his driveway. Lucas's gut churned. That vehicle wasn't welcome there. His knuckles whitened around the wheel as he spotted it. Damian Wells. A shiver of cold sweat broke out along the back of his neck. Damian was more than just a coworker. He was a man Lucas had trusted, someone he had considered a friend. The porch lamp cast a dim glow against the living room window, the curtains drawn just enough to give Lucas a peek inside. And what he saw chilled his blood. Olivia. His wife. She was too close to Damian, their heads bent toward each other, their bodies positioned unmistakably close together. Damian's arm rested informally against the back of the couch, his fingers brushing along Olivia's shoulder. And then as she laughed, not any laugh, that one, the one she reserved for when she was comfortable, secure, contented. Lucas had pursued that sound for years, doing everything within his power to make her laugh, to prevent their marriage from crumbling. And now, she was offering it up to some other man. His heart pounded in his head. And then a voice behind him cut through the blackness like a blade. "Ah, well, the prodigal son returns." And just in time for the show. Lucas whirled around, his jaw tightening as he faced the cold glare of his father, Raymond Carter. The older man leaned against the mailbox, arms crossed, his face twisted into a sneer of sadistic pleasure. "You didn't suppose you were the only one who'd notice, did you?" Raymond blew out a billowy cloud of smoke, pitching his cigarette on the sidewalk. "Olivia's been busy yourself while you've been away saving the world." Lucas kept quiet. He couldn't. Raymond's dry humor rippled, a shake of the head. "And Damian? Well, he's had more than a bit more than just your companion's bargains, hasn't he?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Lucas gulped, trying to catch his breath. "You knew." Raymond shrugged, his expressionless face a mask. "Sure, I knew. Hell, Damian's been paying me to keep quiet. A fat little bonus to keep my mouth shut." A sarcastic, bitter laugh slipped from Raymond's lips. "You really are an idiot, Lucas. You never caught on, did you? Always too busy contemplating your next big thing, your next success. While your wife was spreading her legs for your best friend, and I was making money off your stupidity." Lucas's vision began to blur with rage. His father was always cruel, always succeeded in making him feel small. But this was a sick new level. The weight of the betrayal in his chest, it rested on him until he couldn't catch his breath. Raymond's grin widened. "So what's the game now, kid? Gonna storm in there, have a tantrum, punch Damian in the face, scream at Olivia, question her? And then what? She'll cry, say it was a mistake, beg your forgiveness. And you'll forgive her. Because that's what you do. You're a pathetic little boy who never learned how to stand up for himself." Lucas stared at his father, his fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. Then, something inside him snapped. He exhaled slowly, releasing every ounce of pain, anger, and humiliation into the cold night air. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled. "I'm not going to fight them, Raymond." He took a step toward his father, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "I'm going to destroy them." For the first time that night, Raymond's smirk faltered. Lucas turned away and walked up the steps to his house. Inside, the laughter had stopped. Olivia and Damian sat frozen, their faces paling as they saw him standing in the doorway. "Lucas," Olivia stammered, her voice cracking. "You're home early." Damian shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, searching for anything to say. Lucas didn't give him the satisfaction. He didn't blow up. He didn't query. He simply gazed at them, committing the scene to memory. Olivia's trembling hands in her lap, Damian's sideways glance aside. And then, unspoken, he turned on his heel and moved past them, into his home office. The door slid into place, isolating him from their explanations, their apologies, their weak attempts at salvaging whatever remained. His gaze landed on the picture frame resting against his desk, a wedding day shot. Olivia, smiling in ivory. Himself, his eyes intently locked on her as if nothing else in the world mattered. He slumped back, reached for it, and tossed it into the other room. Glass shattered on the floor. Behind where the frame once hung was a wall safe. Lucas rested his hand on the biometric reader. Soft beep. The door swung open. Inside, stacks of cash, property deeds, bank accounts, everything he had built up over years. He began filling a briefcase with the material, not because he was running, because this wasn't over. His father thought him weak. Olivia and Damien thought they had won. They had no idea what they just deceived. Lucas Carter would not beg. He wasn't going to break. He was going to reduce their world to ashes. Lucas Carter sat in the darkened room of the rundown motel, the gentle hum of the neon light outside creating a ghostly light through the fractured blinds. The Pinecrest Motel was one of those unsavory spots on the outskirts of town where people disappeared overnight to forget, to hide out, or plot their next move. For Lucas, it would be the third. The briefcase was open on the bed beside him, sheets of paper stacked haphazardly across the grimy bedspread. Bank statements, title deeds to houses, investment documents. Everything he had done, everything he had built, all reduced now to a bunch of cold, lifeless numbers. Numbers that Olivia had steadily sucked away. The discovery had struck him worse than the betrayal. Olivia hadn't simply cheated on him, she'd been taking money from him for years. Steady, secretive withdrawals, amounts small enough not to be detected but regular enough to add up to a lot. She'd been planning ahead for his destruction even before he'd ever so much as suspected a thing. A sharp rap on the door made him freeze. He reached out to where he had placed the gun on the nightstand, not because he expected trouble, but because trouble seemed to find him lately. "Lucas, it's me," a gentle voice called out. He breathed slowly and put down the gun before opening the door. His mother, Margaret Carter, came in, her green eyes scanning the room before focusing on him. She had aged well, silver streaked through her dark hair, but her shoulders remained straight, her face impassive. Lucas had called her hours earlier, his voice rough from exhaustion and rage. He had told her everything. Margaret scanned the papers and let a soft sigh. "I knew she was trouble the moment I met her," she whispered, crossing her arms. Lucas let out a harsh laugh. "Yeah? And you didn't see fit to warn me?" Margaret turned back to him steadily. "Would you have listened?" There was nothing but silence. Lucas ran his hands through his hair in frustration. He didn't like that she'd been right. Margaret sat on the bed, examining the papers with the care of a woman who had spent her life unraveling financial mysteries. She had been among the country's top forensic accountants, specializing in white-collar crime. She had retired, leaving behind that world and entering the serenity of her own home. Now, she was playing the game again. "This is not simply plain theft," she said, piercing a highlighted bank transfer. "This is an organized affair. Olivia did not do this alone." Lucas frowned. "Damien." Margaret shook her head. "Maybe. But there is someone else who is responsible for this. These offshore accounts? This level of sophistication? Olivia is too dumb to do this alone." Lucas gritted his teeth. He had wasted years thinking Olivia was innocent, that she was lost, confused, that she had made a mistake. No, she had made decisions. And now, so would he. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number. A few seconds passed before a voice picked up, smooth and assured. "Didn't expect to hear from you, Margaret. What's the occasion?" "I need a favor," she told him, her gaze darting to Lucas. "And I need it fast." A pause. Then, "Where do you need me?" Margaret smiled and addressed Lucas over her shoulder. "She's on her way." Lucas's eyebrows shot up. "She." Margaret sank back into the couch. "Lila Torres. The finest hacker I ever had in training. If there's something dirty to be uncovered, she'll find it." Lucas nodded, the knot of tension in his chest. The game was on, and it was time to play offense. An hour later, a sleek motorcycle pulled up outside the motel. The rider dismounted smoothly, removing her helmet to reveal Lila Torres, mid-20s, dark hair cut into a sharp bob, piercing brown eyes that missed nothing. She strode in with heedless abandon, flinging her leather jacket over a chair. "This is like a crime show," she exclaimed, a smile spreading across her face. "Motel, confidential files, brooding man with revenge in his heart. You've got whiskey somewhere, too." Lucas brushed the comment aside and nodded at the papers. "I want to hear it all. All their emails, bank transactions, telephone calls Olivia and Damien have had in the last 5 years." Lila let out a quiet whistle. "Ambitious." She opened her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Luckily, I love ambitious." She was inside in under 1 minute. Lucas leaned over her shoulder, watching his lines of code stream down the screen. "Okay, let's see what the lovebirds were up to," Lila complained. Then she paused, and her face stiffened. "What?" Lucas growled. She turned the screen toward him. "Your father, Raymond. He's in deeper than we thought." Lucas's stomach turned hollow. Lila opened a folder labeled Private Deals, and before he could process it, the screen was covered with scanned documents, private financial transactions, and Lucas was frozen. Emails. Dozens of them. Among Raymond, Damien, and Olivia. Margaret made a hard breath. Jesus Christ. Lucas read the messages, his hands shaking. Damien. He still doesn't have a clue. When do we implement the last step? Raymond. Be patient. When he loses Tokyo, he'll break. Then he'll have no choice but to come groveling back. We'll strip it all away from him before he even realizes it's happening. Olivia. I just need more time. I don't think he's weak enough yet. Lucas's vision blurred. They had been planning his downfall from the very beginning. Tokyo was never meant to happen for him. Damien had been stealing his designs, Olivia had been draining his accounts, and Raymond, his own father, had been waiting for him to break down so he could step in and finish the job. Lucas drew a sharp breath and tensed, jaws set. We bring them down. Margaret and Lila exchanged a glance. Lila cracked her knuckles. I like where your head's at. But we don't just bring them down, Lucas. We erase them. Margaret's lips curled into a thin smile. I knew I raised you right. Lucas glared at them both, his resolve fixed. He had spent his whole life trying to prove himself to his father, to his friends, to the woman he loved. No more. Now, he wasn't playing to win. He was playing to destroy. Lucas stood in the window of his rented room, gazing at the cityscape. The motel had served its purpose, but now he needed something better. He paid for this place in cash and an assumed name. No paper trail. No digital signature. No mistake. The laptop screen behind him glowed blue, lighting up the room. Lila's fingers danced across the keyboard, her eyes focused intently on the screen, her expression never faltering. Margaret paged through piles of financial documents beside her, squinting at numbers that no longer amazed her. Lucas took slow sips of his whiskey. His father. His best friend. His wife. They had all plotted against him together. And they had almost succeeded. Almost. You won't believe this, Lila growled, spinning the laptop around to present it to them. Damien's got a shell company. Guess who's listed as owning it? Margaret didn't even glance up. Olivia. Bingo. Lila smiled. And she's been funneling money into it for years. With Lucas's business money. The glass he was holding didn't tremble, but he set it down delicately. How much? Militants, she said. Some of that's offshore, but most of it's laundered already. She's been embezzling out of real estate sales, creating dummy consulting companies, even paying out employees who don't exist. Every sale is funneled through your company, but whose signature is on the paperwork? Margaret's lip was compressed to a line. This is not just fraud. This is a federal offense. Lucas took a slow breath, the heaviness of it settling. Can you make it traceable to her? Lila laughed, a short one. Not just traceable. I can make her appear as if she's been attempting to cover her tracks and doing a terrible job at it. Do it, he instructed. Send copies to my lawyer. Anonymous drop. Margaret arched an eyebrow. You still trust lawyers? I trust the ones who owe me favors. Lila popped her knuckles. Step 1. Olivia's money laundering operation is made public. Step 2. Damien's a corporate thief. Step 3. She turned to Margaret. And what about good old Dad? He won't go down so quickly, Margaret said. He's cautious. He'll recognize a setup for what it is. Then we don't let him recognize it for what it is. Lucas fixed his gaze again on the window. We make him desperate. We make him think he's still running things. Margaret and Lila exchanged a glance. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Lila asked. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. I'm just getting started. The first phase of the plan went into motion the next morning. Lucas sat in a coffee shop, scrolling through his phone, espresso untouched. The whistleblower email had gone out to Olivia's company's board of directors at 6 a.m. By 9 a.m., she was under investigation. By noon, it was out. He sat back, watching the quiet murmur of words all around him. People talking softly. Olivia's name spreading. His phone beeped. Text from Lila. She knows. And she's freaking. Incoming meltdown in 3. 2. Then, a call. Olivia's name illuminating the screen. He grinned and let it go to voicemail. Then again. And then again. By the 4th call, he was already on to the next mark. Damien was in his office, oblivious to the storm that was brewing. The anonymous messages started pouring in at 9 p.m. Internal memos. Screenshots. Covert recordings. Proof that he had been stealing Lucas's designs for years and passing them off as his own. At midnight, his inbox was war-torn. Investors pulled out. Project proposals were canceled. The industry moved fast when it caught wind of blood. And then, at 12:05 a.m., his phone rang with an unknown caller. "TikTok, Damien. I wonder how much your clients will pay to keep reading." Panic. His hands trembled. He didn't know who was doing this. Another message. "You should have been more careful whose life you tried to steal." He knew. Lucas. The realization came crashing down like ice water. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out of his office, his brain racing. There was only one person he could turn to. Lucas watched from the security cameras as Damien showed up at Olivia's house. As soon as she opened the door, the yelling started. Without the sound, he could tell by their faces that they were frantic. Damien was out of his mind. Olivia was just as frantic. Then another car pulled up. Raymond got out. Lucas smiled. They were fighting each other. Damien shouted. Olivia objected. Raymond kept quiet, his fists clenched in his hands. Then Damien shoved Olivia. Lucas's smile then eased a bit. She slipped, shock etched on her face. She stared at Raymond, pleading. Raymond shook his head. Lucas shifted forward, noting the stance of his father. Raymond did not care about Damien. He did not care about Olivia. He cared about himself. Lucas picked up his phone and dialed a number. A sleepy voice answered. "Who the hell is calling me at this hour of the night?" "Senator Whitmore. We have to talk." "It's about Raymond Carter." Silence. Then, the voice sobered. "I'm listening." Lucas smiled. It was time for his father to learn what true fear felt like. Lucas Carter leaned back in his chair, the faint glow of his laptop casting harsh shadows on his features. The meeting with Senator Henry Whitmore had been flawless. One mention from Lucas, Raymond Carter, had been enough to pique the senator's interest. Lucas hadn't even needed to prompt. Whitmore had been waiting for an excuse to crucify Raymond. Now all Lucas had to do was sit back and let the storm blow itself out. A notice flashed on his screen. "Lila, we have a problem." Lucas exhaled through his nose and picked up his phone. "Talk." Lila's voice was rapid, abrupt. "Raymond's relocating his money. Offshore accounts, wire transfers. It's like he knows something's coming his way." Lucas knit his brow. "How fast?" "Fast enough that if we don't act now, he'll disappear before we can take him down." Lucas gazed out the apartment window at the city skyline. His father was smart, too smart. But even the most brilliant men made mistakes when they were desperate. "Freeze the transfers," he instructed her. Lila paused. "That's risky. If we move directly, he'll realize someone's moving against him." Lucas's mouth curled into a cold smile. "That's the point." Lila took a breath. "Okay. But when he loses it, you'd better be ready." Lucas ended the call, letting his phone fall onto the table. Across from him, Margaret Carter, his mother, his improbable ally, sat with subdued approval. "You're enjoying this," she said. Lucas didn't answer immediately. He just swirled the whiskey in his glass before taking a slow sip. "I'm enjoying watching them squirm," he admitted. Margaret nodded. "Good. Because it's about to get messy." By noon the next day, Raymond Carter was on the verge of losing control. Lucas sat in a cafe, watching from a distance as his father stormed into a private banking office downtown. The man's usual air of arrogance was gone, replaced by something sharper. Panic. Lucas sipped his coffee, listening to the audio feed Lila had patched through from inside. "Banker, Mr. Carter, I'm sorry, but all your accounts have been flagged for suspicious activity." "Raymond? Flagged? By who?" "Banker, I'm not in a position to tell you that, but we're pursuing legal recourse." Silence. Lucas had envisioned the look on his father's face then, the precise moment when he knew the walls were crashing in. Then the explosion. "Raymond, this is a goddamn error. Do you know who I am?" "Banker, yes, sir. And that's precisely why we're considering this so seriously." Lucas chuckled softly. "Ideal." Lila's voice cackled in his earpiece. "That guy is 2 seconds away from a heart attack." Lucas grinned. "Make him squirm." Lila whistled. "What then?" Lucas shoved himself up, allowing several bills on the table to remain, and strolled out onto the sidewalk. "We just make sure he can't leave." Damien Wells was a cockroach from day one. Whatever happened, whatever crap he got into, he somehow wriggled back into the spaces, stayed alive. But this time, Lucas wasn't offering him a way out. The tip in the anonymous whistleblower email was just the beginning. The second wave? A full-blown industry-wide smear campaign. When Damien arrived at his downtown office, the rumors had escalated into a full-fledged corporate hit. Lucas was across the street when he watched Damien exit his vehicle. His phone to his ear, his expression transformed from fury to sheer terror. Then the haymaker. An older man wearing a suit caught up with Damien, thrusting a handful of papers against Damien's chest. Lucas did not need to hear what they were saying in order to realize what was taking place. Damien's largest shareholders were pulling out. A few hours later, the official word, Wells and Associates was being investigated by the federal government for fraud, intellectual property theft, and corporate espionage. Lucas leaned back in his chair, watching the news coverage with a satisfied smirk. "Go to hell, you bastard," he snarled. If Raymond was too overpowering and Damien was too stubborn, Olivia was simply too delicate to endure what was to be unleashed on her. Lucas knew her better than anybody. He knew exactly how she'd react. And she didn't disappoint him. She showed up that evening at his apartment. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she knocked on the door. Lucas waited before he opened it. He wanted her to feel every second of terror. When he finally did open the door, Olivia looked up at him, eyes bloodshot. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice throaty. He remained silent. She breathed a trembling breath, stepping forward. "I have to talk to you." Lucas leaned in the doorway. "What about?" Her lips parted, then closed. She looked away. "Please. May I enter?" Lucas regarded her for a second before stepping aside. Let her think she still had a chance. She came in, twisting her hands together. "You're doing this, aren't you?" She breathed. "The money missing. The leaks. Damien's career, my job." Lucas crossed his arms. "And?" Olivia's eyes widened. "Lucas, I know I hurt you. I know I..." She swallowed. "I made mistakes. But I never wanted this." Lucas laughed, low and caustic. "That's rich, coming from you." She stepped forward. "I was scared." Her voice cracked. "Raymond, he forced me into this." "He..." Lucas's eyes darkened. "Don't." She flinched. "Don't you dare stand there and pretend you were a victim," he continued, his words slicing like glass. "I read the emails, Olivia. I know exactly what you did. And I know you savored every second." Her breathing halted. "You didn't just betray me," he stated, his tone even. "You tried to destroy me." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I loved you, Lucas." He smiled, the expression cold. "No, you didn't. You loved being smarter than me. Loved owning me. Loved being able to control me." She cracked then, shaking with shoulders racked with sobs. "I don't have anything left," she whispered. "Please, Lucas. I don't have anywhere to go." Lucas glared at her for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke anything at all. "That's not my problem." And with that, he slammed the door shut in her face. Raymond, Damien, Olivia, they were all imploding. But Lucas wasn't finished. The final nail in the coffin tomorrow. The press conference. Lucas had organized it himself. A special industry event, crammed with journalists, executives, and government reps. And right at the very end of the conference, Lucas Carter himself would step out onto the stage and bury them all. Permanently. "Please let me know when you are ready for the next part." Lucas Carter in front of the hotel floor-length mirror, running his hand down the cuffs on his tailored suit. The heavy burden of what he was about to do pressed down across his chest, but there wasn't a waver in his movement. Weeks of preparation were behind him now. It was time. The Everett Grand Hotel was hosting an invitation-only industry conference, a meeting of CEOs, investors, and senior government officials. Everyone who mattered in business and politics would be in that ballroom. And by the time Lucas had finished, so would the truth. There was a knock on the door that brought him back from his daydreaming. He opened it to find Margaret and Lila standing in the doorway, both ready for battle. Margaret handed him a USB drive. "It's all here. The offshore accounts, the fake contracts, the payoffs. Everything last piece of evidence all tracing back to Raymond, Damien, and Olivia." Lila smiled. "I even threw in a little extra. Some of Raymond's encrypted emails with a certain senator who's now pulling out of their deal." Lucas nodded. "Let this burn them all." Margaret stepped forward, a momentary glimmer of kindness in her expression. "Are you sure about this? There's no turning back once this is on the air." Lucas regarded her. "I was never going to turn around." Lila handed him another envelope. "These are copies sent to the FBI and IRS. Once this is on the air, they'll start investigating right away. You wanted them burned? This guarantees it." Lucas breathed deeply. "Then let's get this done." The ballroom was packed by the time he arrived. Business moguls mixed at tables of expensive whiskey, the atmosphere heavy with manufactured bonhomie. Near the end of the room, a stage had been set up for the keynote address. Behind it, a big screen was set for his presentation. Lucas elbowed his way through the crowd, smiling to greet the familiar faces, many of whom had written him off once as nothing more than Raymond Carter's son. Not anymore. The MC took the microphone, clearing his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our honor to introduce tonight's last speaker, a man whose work has shaped the future of our career. Please welcome Lucas Carter. The applause was measured, reserved. They didn't know yet. Lucas stepped forward, adjusting the microphone. The screen behind him bore his name, his company logo, the standard presentation opening. But as he started to talk, all of that changed. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "I'd like to say thanks for coming tonight. And I'd like to thank my father, Raymond Carter, for teaching me the most valuable business lesson of my life." The audience stopped dead. Lucas pressed the remote in his hand. The presentation changed. The first slide appeared on the screen, a bank statement of illicit wire transfers. Whispers coursed through the room. Lucas's tone was tranquil. "The lesson my father taught me? Never trust anyone." Another click. Another slide. This one, an email thread between Damien and Raymond on how to ruin Lucas's Tokyo deal. Gasps coursed through the crowd. Some people whispered to one another. Lucas continued. "I built my career on the assumption of loyalty, integrity. I was wrong. My own father, my own best friend, my own wife conspired against me for years. But the thing about betrayal," he paused, "it leaves a trail." The next slide was on screen. Screenshots of Olivia's fake transactions. One of the front row executives turned to the person next to him to whisper. A man in the rear pulled out his cell phone. The transition was taking place. Lucas looked straight into the crowd. Raymond Carter has for years used his authority to bribe government officials and push through illegal deals. Damian Wells has been stealing intellectual property and fraudulent dealings. Olivia Carter has been embezzlement and laundering money in front companies. He paused long enough for the weight of the words to register. And tonight, the evidence is in the hands of the police. Anarchy erupted. Others reached for their phones. Some rushed quickly to whisper to their aides. Others sat frozen, mouths agape in shock. Lucas stepped back, watching his comprehension spread. Then, at the back of the room, Raymond Carter stood up. His face was unreadable, his shoulders stiff. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at Lucas. For the first time in his life, Lucas saw something in his father's eyes that never existed before. Fear. Raymond clenched his jaw. He turned and strode rapidly towards the door, his step stiff. Damien followed him, face pale and expression unreadable. Olivia? She didn't move. She just sat there, shaking hands, staring at the screen as if she had finally seen the ghost of the future that she created. Lucas did not attempt to stop them. He did not have to. And the world that they had built on lies? It was burning already. At midnight, everything came crashing down. The online video of Lucas's presentation broke viral within 60 minutes. Business cable news programs picked it up instantaneously. Social media sites went wild over reaction, and it was proclaimed as the finest act of corporate vengeance in generations by some. The consequences caught up speedily. The FBI stormed Raymond's offices, seizing computers, papers, and financial records. The IRS started investigating every one of his accounts. At the end of the week, his assets were frozen. Damian Wells was finished. His investors abandoned him overnight, his company collapsed under the burden of lawsuits, and within 72 hours, he lost everything. And Olivia? She tried to get over it. She hired lawyers, lied, tried to maintain the life she had built on lies. But too late. Lucas had seen to it. 1 week later, she was officially indicted for fraud and embezzlement. And like that, they were all gone. Lucas stood at the railing of his balcony, looking out over the city. The world felt lighter now. His phone buzzed. A message from Lila. "Lila, it's done. No going back now." He breathed slowly. Finally, Margaret emerged onto the balcony with him. "You did it." Lucas nodded. Margaret gazed at him for a moment. "So, what next?" He didn't answer for a very long time. "I rebuild." Margaret nodded. "Tokyo?" Lucas smiled a little. "Maybe." The future was his own again for the first time in a very long time. And this time, no one was going to take it away from him. Lucas Carter sat by himself in his penthouse apartment, staring out over the city skyline. The weeks that followed had been a whirlwind of chaos, but now the storm was finally over. The people who had collaborated to bring him down were in prison, bankrupted, or too embarrassed to ever again gain their traction. And yet, sitting there with his glass of whiskey gripped tightly in his hand, there was a hollow feeling stuck in his chest. His entire existence had been built on the foundation of getting even. Now that he'd succeeded, what now? His phone rang. Text from Lila. Lila, they caught Raymond. Finally. Lucas breathed deeply. That was the last piece. The great industrial giant once, the man who had spent his entire life stringing others along, had nowhere to turn. He had tried it. He had used up all his favors, pulled all his strings. But in the end, not even his contacts could save him. Raymond Carter had been taken into custody at a private airport attempting to flee the country. The ultimate humiliation. Lucas set his glass down and stood, his sore muscles complaining. Margaret entered the room, eyes as sharp as ever. It's done, she stated. Lucas nodded. Yeah. She regarded him for a moment. And he hesitated. I thought it would feel different. Margaret's expression eased. Revenge is an unusual thing. It makes you clear, but not peaceful. Lucas shrugged. What now? Margaret smiled. Now? You live. Lucas gave a quiet laugh. I've spent so long fighting, I'm not sure I recall how. Margaret moved closer, squeezing his shoulder. Then it's time you learned. The next morning, Lucas flew to Tokyo. For the first time in years, he wasn't running away from something. He was running towards something new. 3 months on, Lucas stood in the sky-high glass offices of Nexus Developments, Tokyo's leading architecture firm. The moment he had arrived in Japan, he had been offered a role in a massive urban revitalization project, one that would define the city's future skyline. He had accepted without hesitation. Now, as he watched the city below, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see Nicholas Graves, his old mentor, stepping into the office. You've been busy, Nicholas said with a grin. Lucas smirked. That's one way to put it. Nicholas walked over to the window, his eyes smiling in approval. Tokyo suits you. Lucas sighed. It's a fresh start. Nicholas looked at him for a moment. And yet, there remains still the air of man waiting for the next fight. Lucas laughed. Maybe I don't know how to be anything else. Nicholas stood by the window. You broke anyone who followed you. But you can't live your whole life looking over your shoulder, anticipating another foe. Lucas was silent. Nicholas continued. The ultimate revenge isn't breaking your enemies. He fixed Lucas with a stare. It's building a life they can never attain. Lucas took those words in. For so long, his life had been dominated by vengeance. But what if Nicholas was right? What if true victory wasn't achieved through destruction, but through creation? Maybe it was time to find out. That night, Lucas walked through the vibrant streets of Shibuya, his mind acutely focused. He'd spent years seeking justice, vengeance, revenge. Now he was seeking something else. A future that he actually wanted. His phone buzzed. A message from Lila. Lila, Tokyo becomes you, Carter. Lucas smiled, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Lucas, preferable to New York? Lila, a lot better. Less backstabbing, more sushi. Lucas smiled to himself, a gentle laughter. For the first time in years, something long buried awoke within him. Light. Free. Whole. Perhaps Nicholas had been correct. Perhaps the greatest revenge of all was exactly that, getting on with life. And as Lucas Carter became one with Tokyo's city lights, something came to him. He had already won. And now, he was finally free to live.